I'm the facilitator for this Story Circle session. It's been some 4 decades since a collection of young scholars burst on the scene armed with new sets of questions to understanding labor's past. Not to put too fine a point on it, they argued there was more, much more, to labor's story than economics and union politics. The new questions included ones like, what were the lives of people who exchanged their time, their skills, their effort for a wage paid by someone else really like? How did workers confront the industrial process? When did workers begin thinking in class ways? How did the working class family survive the often precarious lives they led? What were the differing experiences of working class men and women? And how did different ethnic and gender dynamics affect and animate the working class? Perhaps beginning with E.P. Thompson's monumental The Making of the English Working Class, and one of its central tenets that the working class were active participants in their own creation, a new generation of scholars rushed out to deepen and broaden our understanding of the history of the working class, much to the benefit of even younger scholars like myself. We are very fortunate to have with us 4 distinguished panelists who have generously agreed to share their own stories on the topic of the new labor history in this country. Bryan Palmer is Canada Research Chair and Chair of the Canadian Studies Department at Trent University. He has published widely in Canadian working class and social history, having written some 12 books and edited half again as many collections. In the relatively recent past, he has begun to investigate radicalism in the 1960s. Greg Kealey is Vice President Research at the University of New Brunswick, but he is also widely known as a leading working class historian, having published the prize-winning and innovative Toronto Workers Respond to Industrial Capitalism, and with Bryan Palmer, Dreaming of What Might Be the Knights of Labour in Ontario. More recently, has completed with Reg Whittaker and Andrew Parnaby a wide-ranging history of the Secret Service in Canada. Linda Kealey is Professor of History at the University of New Brunswick. She, too, is widely known as a leading working class and gender historian. She is the author of Enlisting Women for the Cause, Women, Labour, and the Left in Canada, as well as numerous scholarly articles and edited collections relating to women in the working class. David Frank is Professor of History at the University of New Brunswick. He is past President of the Canadian Committee on Labour History and current Director of the New Brunswick Labour History Project. His most recent work has been in the area of public labour history, which has resulted in Labour Landmarks in New Brunswick. So the twin questions facing us this morning are, why do you do labour history? And why is the sort of labour history you do so important? The idea here is that each of the panelists take 5 minutes or so to speak to the questions, and then we'll open the floor for what I think will be a very rewarding conversation. Near the end, I'll stop things to let graduate student Logan offer his reflections on what we've done here today. So, can I also ask that when people make interventions, once the panelists have finished speaking, that you state your name so that we can get permissions for you later. This is all being recorded. So we'll begin then with David.
True history is the story of the workers. It was they who wrote its page in every day. They're writing it today. I'm quoting here from some verses written by a trade unionist, carpenter, socialist, published in 1913 in a little booklet called Rhymes of Revolt. And that begins to set the theme for our presentation. It's a metaphorical allusion, I guess, to our topic, which is not so much labor history as the history of the labor history that we have written, how workers' history came to become part of our job of doing history, how we came to be in a position of correcting some of the official version of Canadian history, most recently published, I suppose, in the Citizenship Guide. And how we've assisted also in reconstructing the larger history of the society, getting workers back into the main part of the story and out of the footnotes and the leftover part of historical work. Before continuing, I have to just say how impressed I am and how much we admire the work that the Alberta Labour History Institute has done in terms of its range, in terms of its ambition, and in terms of its success. I don't think there's any other province in Canada that can match the same kind of record of partnership and achievement as what we have seen in the last couple of days here, and especially that impressive review yesterday afternoon of all the accomplishments of ALHI really shows what can be done. But we're taking you back to prehistory. We're taking you back to a time when those kind of ambitions were were not immediately in mind nor within grasp, to a time when there was a relatively new field. And there's a certain amount of chance and, I suppose, circumstantiality to the making of historians as well as history itself. To paraphrase Lennon, that would be John Lennon. History is what happens when you're busy making other plans. And this is not a place for a full construction, but I'm going to mention one or two moments in the story, perhaps focus just on the earlier part and not exceed my initial allotment of time. And when I think back, I do think back to the summer of 1971. Quiet summer evening at Rosa Luxemburg House in Halifax, where I was crawling into a sleeping bag on the floor. It was on a street named after one of the Massachusetts military mercantile adventurers who had conquered Louisbourg in 1745. But in more recent times, other people had slept on this floor. Homer Stevens of the United Fishermen had slept there as part of the Canso fishermen's strike in 1970-71. Delegation of Black Panthers had slept there notoriously on a visit to the Halifax black community. And more recent times, this house was the local headquarters for the New Leftists who had organized the East Coast Socialist Movement and their attendant newspaper, the East Coast Worker. I was just recovering from a year out of school where I had been editing the student newspaper at the University of Toronto, a year that included some high-stakes drama such as the October Crisis. And I was returning from a short stint in Newfoundland where I'd helped bring out an alternative newspaper called the Alternate Press. And while I was lying there on the floor, I heard a conversation emanating from the dining room next door, and the substance of that was about a summer project. Plan was to research and publish a history of labor struggles in Cape Breton. And the substance of the discussion was, now that the funds had been assembled, who was going to work on it? So I, of course, cleared my throat and piped up from the next room and said I could work on that. And that was the beginning of a small public education project that was published later that summer that several of us worked on. And from preliminary research through to final paste up. And it was my first introduction, really, to Cape Breton labor history. A history of class conflict barely mentioned in the standard sources, few as they were, such as Harold Logan and Charles Lipton. And it exposed me to the depth of labor history that could be found in a single region, in a single part of the country. And while there was a huge narrative drama to be told there were also some pressing historical questions, such as, given this period of intense class conflict that lasted in the early 1920s through to 1925-26, outlasting the Winnipeg General Strike by 5 or 6 years, what were the sources of working class resistance there? What were the sources of solidarity? What was the nature of this community? What was it about the workplace? What was it about the way of life? What was it about the people that gave rise to this extraordinary manifestation of working class resistance to industrial capitalism? So I was able to explore that in a preliminary way. At that time, I went back, finished my degree at the university, wrote some papers related to this, in one case for John Crispo in industrial relations, in other cases working on Toronto labor history as well, trying to emulate some of the things that Greg Kealey had done, but doing it for a slightly later period. But in the process of returning to my university education, I did discover that the research was exciting and that the prospect of telling at least some of labor's untold story to the general public promised some of the same satisfactions as the journalism career that I seemed to be initially headed towards. And although many of my friends went on to work in the media, I went on to graduate school and after a false start or two, returned to the Cape Breton story. This produced several outcomes, both academic and popular, and some that have tried to be both. I think that story attracted me because it seems so peculiar that in Canada we had almost no historiography of the coal industry, very different from other industrialized countries, where the coal miners seem to be at the center of the narrative of labor history in Britain and France and other industrialized countries in the United States. And some of this was explained by the simple fact that the coal resources in this country are located not at the center of the country, but in the far east and in the far west. And so I also became interested in the political economy of the industry and the political economy of underdevelopment associated with it. Why is it that such huge resources have failed to give rise to long-term economic stability? Why is it that so many opportunities do not give rise to a more stable social environment based on the resources? Well, it's part of the classic Canadian story, and the debate, of course, is being repeated again in Alberta in respect to other industries. So I wanted to emphasize that point, that as labor historians, we became interested in the story of the working class, but not just in the story of their institutions, not just in the story of their strikes, but also in the conditions that gave rise, A, to the problems they faced, and B, to the sources of resistance that they were able to mobilize. So that was sort of my encounter with Cape Breton history, and of course that has continued up to the present. I still have another writing assignment in that field due today. Lots more due this summer, shall we say. But if we cast forward some years, and I won't go into detail about the more recent decades, but if we cast forward some years, I find myself somewhat surprised to discover that I've been able to make a living as a university professor, and indeed as one specializing in labor history. That had to do with my recruitment at the University of New Brunswick, and eventually my recruitment at the insistence, I think, of the local social movements and labor organizations into doing New Brunswick labor history. And we may talk more about this in a few minutes, but several of us have, including Linda and Greg, have just completed a major project on labor history in New Brunswick, some of which will be appearing as a history of the New Brunswick Federation of Labor from Athabasca University Press next year, in time for their 100th anniversary. They may not be the largest federation of labor in Canada, but they are the second oldest surviving one after the Alberta Federation. The only other thing I think I'll end on is that there is an underlying message in labor history, and it's been rendered in many forms and in many different kinds of words by different people, but it's one that I think we associate with as practitioners in the field as well as activists in our own right. And I most recently, strangely enough, heard these words pronounced by famous Canadian singer, but they were barely sung by him, and most people don't even listen very closely to the words. Leonard Cohen had recorded a version of this in the 1970s. They've taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn. But without our skill and muscle, not a single wheel will turn. In our hands is placed a power greater than their hoarded gold. We can bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old. Solidarity forever. Thank you.
Linda, if you'd be so kind to add your remarks.
Yes. Is this on?
It
Oh,
is.
good. Good. You just have such a booming voice, you don't need it. Well, I wish I could start with a story like one that Betsy Jameson started her keynote speech with about being taken to the picket line at 3 years old and having explained to her that they were not going to cross the picket line. But that's not where I started from. I begin my story as a reflection on when I first learned and experienced relations of inequality. Like Betsy, I grew up in the United States, but in upstate New York. My realization of inequality and racism basically first came through reading. As a kid, I read lots and lots. I read James Baldwin's novels, The Fire Next Time, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, as well as works of early feminists. Even when I was in high school, not even knowing what it was, I wouldn't have called it anything except interesting material. In addition, in the summer of 1964, parts of my city burned as frustrated African Americans took to the streets to protest and arrest, but also to protest their conditions and claim their rights. I was 17 at that point, so you can figure out how old I am now. The next year I graduated from high school and ended up coming up to the University of Toronto, and there I became involved in student, New Left, and feminist groups on campus, including a few with Peggy Morton, who's here in the audience. With other students, I protested the war in Vietnam, challenged the practices of the university, sat in to get campus daycare, a very famous struggle at the University of Toronto. And eventually I joined other women, mostly young women, in consciousness-raising groups to discuss and debate the sources and solutions to the oppression of women. So that involvement in student and New Left politics resulted in learning about class differences for me. I learned bits of history about the labor movement and left-wing groups in Canada and the imperialist practices that led to the war in Vietnam and other struggles around the world. I began to read more about the history of women as I was completing a professional degree in library sciences at U of T. And for 2 years, we moved back to the United States, where my husband, the very distinguished gentleman on my right, has... That's him. Oh, you're both very distinguished. Whatever you think about the New Left, no. Anyway, he was in graduate school, completing his coursework in fields for a doctorate in history focused on Toronto's working class in the 19th century, as you've heard. For those 2 years, I worked as a librarian in the very ghetto area that had exploded 6 years earlier during the riots. It was a real learning experience for me, but I decided that a career as a librarian had lost a lot of its attraction. During those 2 years as a librarian, my interest in women's history occupied a lot of my leisure time as I lived with a bunch of graduate students who incessantly talked about E.P. Thompson and Herbert Gutman and Christopher Lasch and who was fighting with whom within the Rochester department. On the other hand, while I did resent being the only quote-unquote working person in that household of graduate students, the debates and discussions that swirled around this group really encouraged me to think about history and to continue to develop my interest in women's history in particular. And it was with the intervention and encouragement of a prominent woman historian at the University of Toronto, Jill Kerr-Conway, who later went on to become the president of Smith College. I then returned to complete a qualifying year in history at U of T in '72, and then was admitted to the history graduate programs to do the MA and the PhD. And as a graduate student, I became involved again with the women's movement in Toronto, with the Women's Press, and I played a role in creating a pioneering collection of articles, Women at Work, Ontario, 1850 to 1930, which won the City of Toronto Book Award in 1974. And a second volume came out from the Women's Press in 1978, which I edited, called A Not Unreasonable Claim, Women in Reform in Canada, 1880s to 1920s. And although I did not end up pursuing in my graduate career a topic in women's history, I was able to return to women's history in Canada when I started to work at Memorial University in the early 80s. I was able then to obtain some research funding that eventually resulted in the book on labor and socialist women in Canada, the one mentioned by our kind leader, Eric. In recent years, I've been involved in several major research grants that have focused on health and labor history. The most recent one referred to by David, we had a Community University Research Alliance grant focusing on labor history in New Brunswick. And I chose to focus my efforts there on the work and organization of nurses in the province of New Brunswick since 1950, completing 30 interviews with nurses and nursing activists. And one of my MA students wrote about the early history of nursing activism in the 1960s. That resulted in the creation of the New Brunswick Nurses Union in 1978, just shortly after the Alberta Union was created. And I have been able to publish several articles out of that, but I really hope to do something of a more popular nature with those interviews and the material that I've gathered. So in sum, I see myself as someone who's been able to combine my academic and activist interests by doing research and writing on women's history, especially in the area of women's work and labor organization, by encouraging and steering my students to explore these topics, and also by helping to found and teach in women's studies programs, particularly at Memorial University in the early 1980s. And I have been a very active in the women's movement at various times of my life. And I really see my life as being a kind of combination of being able to do the activism and combine it with the research that has a purpose. And so I was very interested to hear the discussion in the previous session about public sector unionism and some of the discussion about professionals not being able to be unionists, because that's the exact same struggle that the nurses in New Brunswick had as they were forming their union. And so they talk about it as wearing two hats, which I think is a wonderful metaphor. And I think I wear two hats as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Bryan.
Greg Kealey?
I think some not surprising themes are emerging, and of course, equally not surprising given the overlaps of my life with Linda's and indeed with David's and Bryan's. I think the key to all of this is the decade of the 1960s and politics, and the interrelationship of how each of us in our own different ways, and mine was a bit different than David's or Linda's or Bryan's for that matter, how those things came together and set us off with a set of questions that really emerged out of the struggles of the 1960s. Can people hear me at the back? Speak up a little bit? Okay, sorry. I'm seldom criticized for this. It's this quasi-autobiographical thing that's a little weird. So just a little bit about me in that mode. My father was worked most of his life as a brewery foreman. He'd been a brewery worker, Irish Catholic from the Ottawa Valley. So the family was very Catholic in its orientation. I went to parochial schools and then to a high school in Toronto called St. Michael's College School, and then to St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. Now, proud atheist that I am, I usually don't acknowledge this, but I don't think that there's any question that the kind of social activism associated with that very brief moment in Catholic Church history, Vatican II and all that stuff, and the kind of orientation of the particular order of priests, which was quite social activist, that played a role in at least starting me thinking about inequality. I got active in the anti-war movement in high school, active in the NDP, which as a high school student even puzzled me because it was clear why we shouldn't have anything to do with Vietnam, but there was all this stuff about NATO and NORAD with apologists from the NDP claiming how important it was to be part of that alliance. There were Trotskyists all over the place trying to organize high school students. I remember that was a bit confusing too. I remember going on the big train ride to Ottawa, which I should remember what year it is. Chris can probably tell me. Anyway, that was sort of part of the high school orientation. And then at university, I started in 1966, spent 2 summers, the summer of 1967 in Winnipeg, in the north end of Winnipeg, on a kind of CYC-like but shorter version, and was suddenly kind of having grown up in the suburbs of Toronto, thrown into the north end of Winnipeg and what that reality looked like at that particular point in time. The next summer, Linda and I, who were by then together, spent in Vancouver running a soup kitchen for displaced hippies. That was a whole different kind of orientation socially, but certainly kind of significant interest. Back at U of T, of course, student politics, big time, the New Left Caucus that Linda alluded to until Peggy threw the males out of it, which was probably a good thing. And then we were kind of left doing various macho things that got many of us in trouble, including me, and left me thinking that, and as the 60s kind of started to go on a direction that I think was less satisfying than the earlier parts of it, left me with a lot of intellectual questions and thinking that I wanted to answer those. I also had always been interested in history. It was kind of from high school on, it was just about the only thing I was interested in. University of Toronto offered very little to answer the kinds of historical questions that I had become interested in, which, as Eric suggested in his introduction, did swirl around the works of Edward Thompson and the other British Marxist historians. And the closest that I could get to that was to go to study with one of the major American proponents of that school of history, who was Herbert Gutman, as Linda mentioned. It was a University of Rochester. We were there for a couple of years. All the other students came out of New Left movements. It was a fascinating time. Learned as much from the students as I did from the very good professors that I dealt with. But it was really, it was kind of one of those learning experiences that I don't know that I'll ever replicate again, and one of the ones that you strive for in intellectual life, but probably only happens at certain moments. Again, all because of the 60s. Then came back, worked on my thesis, published, well, took a little while to get Toronto Workers out, but probably the moment of importance to us all collectively was there was a thing that had already been created then called the Committee on Canadian Labour History, the now Canadian Committee on Labour History. And I got involved very early in that and kind of good organizational tactics. Get in at the front end, and so the major thing that
stay as treasurer forever?
Stay forever. As editor for 21 years, as treasurer still. And that led to the creation of the journal, what it was called Labor Le Travailleur, another huge mistake from a gender perspective, but we changed that eventually. About 1980, we changed that. And I think the collective that surrounds that, it was never an individual story. The collective that surrounds that really has been the framework for the establishment, I think, of this kind of writing about labor and working class history that really made it a mainstay, something that's lost a little of its luster, I fear, probably tells you as much about the times as anything else, but nevertheless a main part of Canadian historical practice. We always tried to orientate towards the labor movement. We always included labor movement activists on the editorial board. They were sometimes a little hard to find because we were seen as much too Marxist for the respectable labor movement. But we found them, of course, as one always can in the labor movement, largely among various forms of old lefties, and then eventually, of course, new lefties rose in the labor movement as well. So I think this, as I started, I think the real key thing here is the intersection of politics, of serious academic struggle. It's not just politically, it's politically driven in its motivation, but it needs to be honest intellectual work, and all those things coming together. And with that, I'll pass it on to Bryan.
Well, I want to thank the conference organizers. You can all hear me, correct? For asking me to participate in this. And like David, I'll start with some verse, but slightly different. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but oh, to be young was very heaven. And that's Wordsworth writing on the French Revolution and that era. Now, our time was not that. But what I do remember very much in looking back on the beginnings of sort of coming to labor history, for me in the very early 1970s, was really the exhilaration that a young group of which we were all a part had as part of a collectivity that was really embarking on something that we thought was quite exciting and something that was quite new. We were trying to bring to the study of the Canadian working class perspectives and theoretical insights and approaches that came from outside the country. And that really, it's hard to imagine now, but that drew a great deal of animosity from an older guard who had studied the Canadian labor movement and Canadian politics. People who were very committed to an institutional approach, which focused on the unions, and very committed politically to a social democratic approach that validated the new democratic parties and CCF traditions. And we were not, as much as we were presented, as being opposed to that, to studying those areas, but we insisted on the study of other aspects of working class experience. And I think the real, and this collectivity, many of the people who were involved never really made it into university lives, teaching, writing. People like Wayne Roberts, who ended up writing for Now magazine and does a lot of independent freelancing. People like Russell Hahn, who was very close to Greg and was in the very early stages, was a very important figure. And there were others who, kind of dropped by the wayside. But as Greg indicated, all of these people came out of a moment in the 60s. And I think our great strength was really, was misunderstood. We were depicted by people who were, I think, somewhat chagrined at our brazenness and our, what we were trying to do. We were socially constructed as a very tight collectivity. I remember Viv Nellis wrote an article in Saturday Night describing labor historians as traveling in packs and wearing their leather jacket uniforms. He's gone into kind of, what's this fabric called? Something else, quite different, not leather. In any case, there was this notion of a real coherence. And I think the mistake there was that we very much knew what we were against. We weren't quite sure what we were really for. I mean, we had a loose sense of what we were about, and all of that's been talked about. But the project was, in fact, highly differentiated by different personalities, by slightly different politics, but in the politics of the left, it's that 2 or 3% that matters. It's not the 97% that you actually agree on. And we have all had slightly different backgrounds and orientations. I think perhaps the irony of our collective project was, and here, my other panelists might disagree, but we were tremendously successful to the point that we failed. We were tremendously successful to the point that I think we did actually win the discussion in mainstream Canadian historical circles about the necessity of transforming how one looks at working class experience, inserting workers and other oppressed groups and women, the limited identities that Ramsey Cook and Morris Careless had talked about. We were successful in inserting them into the historical process and historical writing. We were tremendously successful, and I don't speak for myself, but for my colleagues, in actually, being influential in the Canadian historical profession. I mean, we have a past president of the Canadian Historical Association here, Greg, and another past president, Craig Heron. I don't know of any other national culture quite, well, maybe where the National Historical Association has had two people of our generation. But in some senses, for all the successes, a lot hasn't changed, nevertheless. A lot hasn't changed. And that speaks to the project that sort of needs to be continued and where I think the youth to be very heaven and to find, the way of utilizing their energies and their ideals and their commitments to kind of readdress in their ways all of the kinds of things that this conference has been about and has been, I think, presenting so many sort of useful perspectives on. That task is still very much alive, and it's also, as all of us, I think, would agree, a project both intellectual and political, one that involves thinking through complex problems, but also acting on them in concert with people outside of university settings, people in the labor movement, people on the left. And that's a project which is still ongoing and where there are still very, very many new and pressing challenges and obviously very important victories yet to be won. Thank you very much.